Perek Mem Hey, the 45th chapter of the book of Yirmiyahu, is in some ways, we said this yesterday. Yesterday was sort of Yirmiyahu's last prophecy chronologically, and this is sort of the last prophecy that we have of this book of him giving to Bnei Israel. Afterwards, we're going to have prophecies to the other nations. We're going to have some historical chapters. So this is different. And what's interesting about it, and maybe the reason why it's put at the end, even though chronologically it's not the end, is that it speaks to, in a sense, it speaks to the future, and we'll see how. Although a lot of his prophecies speak to the future. Hadavar asher diber Yirmiyahu hanavi el Baruch ben Neriah b'chatvo et hadvarim ha'ela al sefer mipi Yirmiyahu b'shana haraviit liYoyakim ben Yoshio melech Yudah lemor. So we're going back in history. We were in the year 586 after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, maybe 585, who knows, with the killing of Gedaliah. The Jewish year has changed. So maybe it's 1 year later in the Jewish year, even if it's the same in the before the Common Era. Now we're going back. We're going back a decade. We're going back to the time of a previous king of Yehoiakim. And Yehoiakim was a king who didn't want to listen to God. Tzidkiyahu was scared. Tzidkiyahu at Yirmiyahu, what should I do? And Tzidkiyahu doesn't listen. He wants to listen, but he's scared. He doesn't have the power. He doesn't have the strength. Yehoiakim was the king that Yirmiyahu was in prison. And he was told to write a scroll, and he gave it to Baruch ben Neriah, and Baruch ben Neriah went and read it at the temple. And many of the officers at the temple were scared and worried, and they brought it to other officers, and they were scared and worried. And then finally, they brought it to the king. And if you remember, the king was in his what I call the winter palace, his Beit HaChoref. And the king went. What did he do? He went and he burned the scroll. So everybody was worried, and the king said, I'm not worried about this. So we're going back to that time period, presumably something about that, with Yirmiyahu now giving a prophecy, or what he's supposed to say to his loyal scribe, to his student, to his Na'ar, to Baruch ben Neriah. Ko amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael alecha Baruch. This is what God says to you, Baruch. You've said so many things to the Jewish people. Amarta, you said, Baruch. What did you say so many times? You said, Oy na li, ki asaf Adonai yagon. You said many times that, oh, woe is me, because I have grief. Yagati va'anchati umnucha lo matzati. Agav va'anchati. You say those words in Tachnun, right? I am worn out with groaning. I have found no rest. Remember, after this prophecy, the one where he gives the scroll, and then the king takes the scrolls and he burns it, and then Baruch goes back, and Yirmiyahu writes a second scroll. And after that, both Yirmiyahu and Baruch are threatened by the king. It's not just one of them, it's both of them. And so, yes, you're whining, you're complaining, you found no rest. And it's got to be harder, in a sense, for Baruch than it is for Yirmiyahu. The opening chapter of this book, God comes to Yirmiyahu and says, I chose you from the womb. This is your mission. This is what you have to do. You're going to say prophecies of building, but many more prophecies of destruction. What's the first thing he sees? He sees this bubbling over, this cauldron that's going to come down from the north and cause destruction. And God says to Yirmiyahu, I'll protect you. And though I'm sure that Yirmiyahu said to Baruch ben Neriah, I'll protect you, Baruch only heard it from Yirmiyahu. He didn't hear it from God the same way. And Baruch seen his mentor, his teacher, beaten, thrown in pits, punished, and thus it has worn on Baruch as well. So God says to Baruch, Ko tomare love. Yirmiyahu, tell Baruch as follows: Kol amar Adonai, hine asher baniti ani hores, v'et asher natati ani notesh, v'et kol haaretz hi. What does God say? I'm going to overthrow what I have built and uproot what I have planted. This applies to the whole land. Just because you listen to me, Baruch, doesn't mean things are going to be simple for you. Things are not going to be simple for you. And continue in verse 5. Yatav tivakesh lecha gedolot al tivakesh. And you expect great things for yourself? Look at the time that you are living in. Don't expect them. The people are terrible. This is a time of destruction. Ki hinini mevi ra'a al kol basar numa Adonai v'natati lecha et nafshecha l'shalal al kol hamakot asher telech sham. There's going to be destruction, disaster for everyone. But at least I'll grant you your life wherever it is that you go. I will, God says, I will continue to protect you, Baruch. That is what's going to happen to you. You will be alive. And Baruch is Yirmiyahu's scribe. He's a professional. He writes in Hebrew. He writes in Aramaic, but it's very difficult for him. And there's interesting, if we think about some of Moshe had a student Yoshua, and Moshe led, and then Yoshua led. And Eliyahu had a student Elisha, and when Eliyahu went into the heavens, Elisha took over. Elisha had a student named Gehazi. That didn't work out because of Gehazi. And the Midrash says that what Baruch is saying is this chapter is, why don't I have prophecy? Why am I not taking over? Baruch wanted the mantle of prophecy. He wanted to lead once like Yirmiyahu. But Yirmiyahu says, this is not a time of greatness. This is not a time of what's going to happen. That's not the plan at this point in time. You are here to write down my prophecies and not to take over. And that's got to be a difficult thing to Baruch, thinking maybe one day that he was going to be not just a scribe, but that he himself would take over for Yirmiyahu. But he's told that that's not the case. And I think, sort of part of it, if we think about it, is Yirmiyahu's job, and we've talked about a lot in this book, and I think it's very relevant for today. What's relevant for today? Think about the terrible war in Israel. Nobody's mivakesh gdolo. Nobody is asking for great things. People are asking to remain alive, to be safe. This is not the time to think of the great dreams other than the great dream of peace, which is the most elusive of all dreams, seemingly. And Yirmiyahu is telling Baruch, now's not the time. This is not going to happen. This is not the way it is. Yirmiyahu's prophecy is survive, submit, and at some point in time, redemption will happen. But it's not happening now. And so Yirmiyahu, Baruch is being told, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get this at this time. We're going to need a different prophet. We're going to need somebody from a different place. In a sense, we need a new start. And if we go back to the book of Kings, which is this is sort of the end of the book of Kings. This is the end of the time of the first Beit HaMikdash. We talked to the book of Kings, Shlomo and the cutting of the baby in half and keeping the nation alive and keeping the nation together. And eventually it's not the kings anymore. It's the prophets, Eliyahu and Elisha. And eventually they fall away. There's Yeshaya, there's Chizkias, they're good kings. There's Yoshiyahu, who keep the people alive. But now destruction is full. The prophets can't keep the people alive anymore. And we're going to need a new prophet. We're going to need somebody from a different place. It can't be somebody from here. In the same way, in a similar way, I should say, when we think about the beginning of these books. When we think about these books, we link together really the book of Shmuel and the book of Melachim. Shmuel, who's the kingmaker, the one who anoints Shaul, the one who anoints David. So that's really the beginning of this part of Jewish history. You put it as such. I think, up to that point, there was no king. And so this is a different era. And Shmuel also came about at a time of destruction. And while Shmuel was in Shiloh, kind of like how Baruch is in Yerushalayim and is the student of Yirmiyahu, the whole idea of who Shmuel is, from his mother when she shows up at the temple in Shiloh, and the prophet and the prince and the priest of Shiloh think she's drunkard, and she's not drunk. Shmuel's teachings are, in a sense, against Shiloh. He's the anti-Shiloh. He learns in Shiloh, and he learns from Eli, but maybe so much of what he learns is not to do rather than what there is to do. And so after the destruction of Shiloh, it's a new start, and it's a new way. And Baruch here, who presumably was part of people say he's part of a noble family. He's part of in a sense, I would say the ruling family. He's too much of a culture of this destruction. And his teacher and his prophet is the one who's rising him up. But he's not a rejection in a sense of that culture. He's still with them. He goes down to Egypt with them in the same way Yirmiyahu, when they're taken there. And God says you're going to be protected when that's going to happen. But he's not distanced enough, I think, to be the next prophet, to be the Yechezkel, to be the one who's going to say to Bnei Yisrael, Yechezkel, Chazak El, right? At a time of destruction, you need somebody who's going to give strength to Bnei Yisrael, that God is strong. Don't think that God is diminished. God is still strong. just that God, for whatever reasons, is somewhat removed. And so it's a disappointing chapter. Baruch wants to be like Yoshua, to get prophecy, to lead Bnei Israel. Not exactly that way. He was a military leader. He wants to be like Shmuel. He wants to be like Elisha. And even though he's not like Gehazi, Elisha's students, who is seen as a wicked person, I think that it's the culture in which he's in and the person that he's learning from. And that's not to take anything away from Yirmiyahu, but he is not the right person. We need a break. We need a complete severance from the time of this destruction to find a new prophet to lead Bnei Israel. And so a disappointing chapter, whether it is sort of this midrashic sort of way that he's complaining about his lack of prophecy, that he's complaining he's not going to be the next prophet, or whether it's just, the difficulties of life. That God said to Yirmiyahu, your life is going to be very difficult, but I'll be with you. But it's much harder for Baruch, even though he trusts Yirmiyahu 100%, it's much harder for him when he was not the one who was spoken to directly by God. And so we feel for Baruch at this time. And, as we think about these days that we're in, just like God says to Yirmiyahu, tell Baruch, right now is the time to remain alive. Right now is the time to just get through it. This is, yes, Yirmiyahu or Yeshaya before him has talked about great prophecies that will happen in the future, but that's not for right now. And so Baruch, it comes down as a non-prophet. He's known as Baruch ben Neriah HaSofer, Baruch ben Neriah the scribe, and a character we'll meet a couple of hundred years after this. If we compare him, there's another scribe, Ezra HaSofer. So it's not such a bad thing to be a scribe. Ezra HaSofer, who the Gemara talks about and says if the Torah was not given by Moshe, Ezra was so great it could have been given by him. So at his time, it's difficult for Baruch, but we look back at him and see him as a scribe, as an amazing thing in a way that this great book, which hopefully we see destruction, but we see there's going to be future. We know that Baruch's words are so important to us even today.